The dungeon beneath the royal palace smelled of wet stone and despair, a scent Mira had become intimately familiar with over the past 3 weeks. She sat on the cold floor of her cell, her back pressed against the damp wall, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the ground as she replayed the moment her life had shattered, the moment she had dared to speak truth to power and found herself branded a traitor to the crown. The chains around her wrists were silver, burning her skin with a constant reminder that she was considered dangerous enough to suppress her wolf. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was an Omega, the lowest rank in their hierarchy, yet here she was, bound in the same restraints they used for rogue alphas who had lost themselves to bloodlust. The sound of heavy boots echoed down the stone corridor, and Mira's head lifted. It was too early for the evening meal, which meant only one thing: another interrogation. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she refused to let fear show on her face. She had been defiant when they dragged her from the Grand Library, defiant when they threw her into this cell, and she would remain defiant until her last breath. The door to her cell swung open with a groan of protesting metal, and 2 guards entered, their expressions carefully blank. They hauled her to her feet without gentleness, and she bit back a gasp as the silver chains pulled tight against her raw wrists. They led her through the twisting corridors of the dungeon, up worn stone steps, and finally into a room she had seen too many times already. The interrogation chamber was sparse, containing only a heavy wooden table, 2 chairs, and walls lined with implements she tried not to look at too closely. But today, something was different. Today, the man sitting behind the table wasn't Lord Castellan, the king's chief interrogator. Today, it was the king himself. Alpha King Dorian sat with an air of absolute authority, his powerful frame making the chair seem small beneath him. His dark hair was pulled back from a face that could have been carved from granite, all sharp angles and hard lines. His eyes, a startling amber that seemed to glow in the dim torchlight, fixed on her with an intensity that made her wolf whimper despite the silver suppressing it. He was devastatingly handsome in the way that dangerous predators often are, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Mira forced herself to meet his gaze, even as the guards shoved her into the chair across from him. She wouldn't cower. She had done nothing wrong, and even if he killed her for it, she would face her end with her head held high. For a long moment, Dorian simply studied her, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and resonant, carrying the kind of natural authority that made alphas instinctively want to submit. But there was something else there too, something that sounded almost like curiosity. "Tell me," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "What makes an Omega archivist believe she has the right to question 5 centuries of law and tradition? What drives someone of your rank to commit treason against the crown?" Mira felt anger flare hot in her chest, burning away the fear that had been creeping through her veins. "Treason," she repeated, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Is that what we're calling historical accuracy now? I presented documented evidence, Your Majesty. Primary sources from the founding era, sealed records that have been hidden away in the restricted archives for generations. I committed no crime except telling the truth." Dorian's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. "The truth, as you interpret it," he corrected coldly. "You presented documents that, if legitimate, would undermine the very foundation of our society. Documents that claim the Omega subjugation laws were based on fabricated history. Do you understand the chaos such claims could unleash? Do you comprehend the damage you could do to the stability of this kingdom?" She leaned forward as much as her chains would allow, her green eyes blazing with conviction. "I understand that our people have been lied to for 500 years, she shot back. "I understand that the supposed Great Omega Uprising that justified stripping my kind of all rights and freedoms never actually happened. It was invented by Alpha King Aldrich II to consolidate power after the Civil War. The real historical records show that Omegas were advisors, healers, scholars, and leaders before your ancestor decided we were easier to control if we were kept powerless. I understand that every law oppressing my people is built on a foundation of lies. And yes, Your Majesty, I believe that truth matters more than convenient stability. The room fell into tense silence. The guards behind her shifted uncomfortably, clearly shocked that anyone would dare speak to their king with such boldness. Dorian's eyes had darkened, his alpha presence pressing down on the room like a physical weight. Mira felt it trying to force her into submission, that primal instinct to bow before a more dominant wolf screaming at her to lower her eyes, to apologize, to beg for mercy. She gritted her teeth and held his stare. "If you want me to tell you what you want to hear," she continued, her voice quieter but no less fierce, "then you're wasting your time. You can torture me, you can execute me, but you cannot make me unsee what I've seen or unknow what I know. Those documents exist, Your Majesty. The truth exists, whether you acknowledge it or not." Something flickered across Dorian's face, too quick for her to identify. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against stone, and began to pace. His movements were controlled but carried an underlying tension, like a predator deciding whether to pounce or retreat. "You speak of truth," he said finally, his back to her, "but you know nothing of leadership. You don't understand the delicate balance required to keep thousands of wolves from tearing each other apart. My father taught me that strength and order are what hold a kingdom together, that hierarchies exist for a reason, that everyone knowing and keeping to their place is what prevents anarchy." He turned to face her again, and she was startled to see genuine conflict in his expression. "If what you claim is true, if these documents are authentic, do you have any idea what releasing that information would do? The riots, the bloodshed, the complete collapse of social order?" Mira's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, but she kept her voice level. "I know it would be difficult," she acknowledged. "I know there would be resistance and anger and fear, but I also know that a society built on lies is already broken, Your Majesty. It's just that some of us have to live with the consequences of those lies every single day while others benefit from them. You worry about chaos and instability, but have you ever considered what it's like to live as an Omega in your kingdom? To be denied education beyond basic literacy, to be barred from most professions, to be seen as little more than breeding stock, to have no legal recourse if an Alpha decides to harm you because Omega testimony holds no weight in your courts. That is the daily reality for thousands of your subjects. So forgive me if I don't share your concern about disrupting a system that treats my people as less than wolves." She watched as her words landed, saw something shift behind his eyes. For just a moment, the iron control slipped, and she glimpsed something that might have been shame or doubt, or perhaps understanding. But then his walls slammed back into place, and his expression hardened once more. "You will remain in the dungeon until I decide what to do with you," he said coldly, moving toward the door. "The investigation into your documents will continue. If they are forgeries, you will be executed for treason and sedition. If they are authentic," then he paused, his hand on the door handle, and she could see the tension in his shoulders. "If they are authentic, then we will deal with that complication when the time comes." He left without another word, and the guards hauled Mira to her feet, dragging her back toward the depths of the dungeon. But as she was led through the corridors, Mira couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened in that room. The king hadn't dismissed her claims outright. He had seemed genuinely troubled by her words, genuinely conflicted. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had expected from the man known throughout the kingdom as the Iron King, the Alpha who ruled with absolute authority and showed mercy to no one. Back in her cell, Mira huddled against the wall, trying to ignore the burning of the silver against her skin. She thought about the documents she had found, carefully hidden in a sealed section of the archives that hadn't been opened in centuries. She had stumbled upon them by accident while cataloging some water-damaged texts, discovering a hidden compartment behind a rotted shelf. The journals and official records inside had been revelatory and horrifying in equal measure. They detailed how Alpha King Aldrich II, Dorian's ancestor, had emerged victorious but politically vulnerable from a brutal civil war, facing resistance from Omega advisors and scholars who questioned his increasingly authoritarian policies. Aldrich had orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy. He had his own agents commit acts of violence and sabotage, then blamed these crimes on a fictitious Omega uprising. Using the manufactured crisis as justification, he had implemented emergency measures that stripped Omegas of their rights, their positions of influence, their voices. And when the fake crisis passed, the emergency measures had simply become permanent law. Generation after generation had grown up believing the lies until they became accepted truth, until even Omegas themselves believed they were naturally inferior, naturally meant to be subordinate. The sound of footsteps interrupted her dark thoughts, but these were different from the heavy tread of guards. These steps were lighter, more hesitant. A figure appeared outside her cell, cloaked and hooded, and Mira tensed. The figure pulled back their hood, revealing a woman perhaps 10 years older than Mira's 25, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled into a braid. "I don't have much time," the woman whispered urgently. "My name is Elena. I'm a healer in the palace, and I wanted you to know that there are those of us who believe you, who have always suspected something was wrong with the official histories." She pressed a small bundle through the bars, a clean cloth wrapped around bread and cheese, along with a small tin of salve. "For your wrists," Elena added softly. "The silver burns will get infected if you don't treat them." Mira accepted the bundle with shaking hands, tears pricking her eyes at this unexpected kindness. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Elena's smile was sad. "Because I'm an Omega too," she said simply. "Because I had a daughter once, brilliant and curious, who wanted to be a scholar like you. She was denied entry to the university because of her rank. She died last winter, her spirit broken by a world that told her she was worthless. If there's even a chance that you're right, that things could change, then I have to help, even if it's just bringing you food and medicine." She glanced nervously down the corridor. "The king has ordered your documents examined by the royal historians. There's a lot of argument happening in the council chambers. Some are calling for your immediate execution, but others are saying the documents need to be properly authenticated first. Be strong, child. You may have started something that can't be stopped." With that, Elena pulled her hood back up and disappeared into the shadows. Mira clutched the bundle to her chest, overwhelmed by the gesture. She wasn't alone. Even here, in the depths of the king's dungeon, there were those who dared to hope for change. She carefully unwrapped the salve and began treating her ravaged wrists, hissing at the sting, but grateful for the relief. As she ate the simple meal Elena had brought, Mira allowed herself to imagine what the kingdom could become if the truth came to light. A world where Omegas could pursue education, where their voices carried weight, where they were seen as equals rather than property. It seemed like an impossible dream. But then again, 3 weeks ago, she would have said defying the Alpha King and surviving was impossible too. Days blurred together in the dungeon's eternal twilight. Mira received no more visits from King Dorian, but Elena came when she could, always bringing small comforts and whispered news from above. The council was in chaos, Elena reported on her 3rd visit. The royalty. Historians have confirmed the documents are authentic. The seals, the paper, the ink, all of it dates to the correct period. They can't deny it's real, but they're fighting about what it means. Some are saying the documents are real, but Aldrich's propaganda was justified anyway. Others are calling for the whole thing to be sealed away and forgotten. And a very few, are saying the laws need to be changed. The king hasn't spoken publicly about any of it. He's locked himself in the royal study for hours at a time. Mira absorbed this information, trying to quell the hope rising in her chest. Dorian was actually considering the implications. He hadn't simply buried the evidence and ordered her executed. That had to mean something, didn't it? But she also knew that acknowledging the truth and acting on it were very different things. On the 30th day of her imprisonment, the guards came for her again. But this time, instead of taking her to the interrogation chamber, they led her up different stairs, through corridors that grew progressively more ornate. Mira's confusion grew as they passed through hallways hung with tapestries and lit by crystal chandeliers. Where were they taking her? They stopped before an enormous set of double doors carved with the royal crest, 2 wolves circling each other beneath a crown. The guards knocked, and a voice from within called for entry. Mira was ushered into what was clearly the king's private study. The room was magnificent, lined floor to ceiling with books, dominated by a massive desk covered in papers and maps. And standing by the window, staring out at the gardens below, was Dorian. He turned as she entered, and she was struck by how exhausted he looked. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his usual immaculate appearance was disheveled, his shirt partially unlaced, his hair falling loose around his shoulders. He dismissed the guards with a wave, and suddenly, Mira found herself alone with the Alpha King. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension and unspoken words. Finally, Dorian spoke, his voice rough as though from disuse. "The documents are real," he said without preamble. "Every historian I've consulted, even those most loyal to the crown, admits they're authentic. My ancestor fabricated the Omega Uprising. Everything we've built our laws upon for 5 centuries is a lie." Mira's breath caught. She had known it was true, had bet her life on it being true. But hearing him acknowledge it felt surreal. "What will you do?" she asked quietly. Dorian let out a bitter laugh and turned to face her fully. "That's the question, isn't it? What does a king do when he discovers his entire reign is based on injustice? When he realizes that the father he admired, the lineage he's so proud of, is built on the oppression of innocence?" He moved to his desk, picked up a leather-bound journal, and held it out to her. "This was my father's private diary. I've been reading it since the, Historians confirmed your findings. Did you know he knew? My father discovered the same documents you did, 20 years ago, and he chose to bury them. He wrote that the truth was inconvenient, that maintaining order was more important than historical accuracy, that the Omega laws served a useful purpose regardless of their origins." The pain in Dorian's voice was raw and real, and despite everything, Mira felt a stab of sympathy. She took the journal carefully, her silver chains clinking. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "I know what it's like to have your understanding of the world shattered." He laughed again, but there was no humor in it. "Are you? Are you really sorry? You've been proven right about everything. You're the hero of this story, the brave Omega who stood up to tyranny. And I'm the villain, the latest in a long line of kings who've perpetuated a monstrous injustice." Mira shook her head firmly. "You didn't create this system," she said. "You inherited it. The question isn't whether you're responsible for the past. The question is what you'll do now that you know the truth." Dorian stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his amber eyes. And there it was, the feeling that had been building since the moment she'd been dragged into his presence, the strange pull she'd been trying to ignore, suddenly crystallized into absolute certainty. The scent hit her all at once, breaking through even the silver's suppression. Pine and winter rain and something, wild and electric, that made her wolf surge forward despite the chains. No, it couldn't be. But Dorian's expression had changed too. His pupils dilating, his body going rigid. She watched his throat work as he swallowed hard, saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. "You feel it?" he said. And it wasn't a question. His voice had dropped to something almost like a growl. "You're my mate." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and undeniable. Mira's mind reeled. Of all the cruel ironies the universe could have thrown at her, this was perhaps the worst. The man who had imprisoned her, who represented everything she was fighting against, who ruled over the system that oppressed her people, was her fated mate. The bond she'd dreamed about since she was old enough to understand what it meant. The connection that was supposed to bring joy and completion. And it was with him. She took a step back, shaking her head in denial, even as her wolf whined in protest. "No," she breathed. "This isn't possible. This isn't fair." Dorian moved toward her, his movements predatory and desperate. "I've been feeling something since the first interrogation," he said. "I couldn't understand why I couldn't stop thinking about you, why your words haunted me, why I couldn't bring myself to order your execution even when the council demanded it. Now I know. The mate bond was trying to form even through the silver. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps stories like this reach more people who might need to hear them. Mira held up her chained hands between them like a ward. "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't you dare use the mate bond as an excuse. Nothing has changed. You're still the king who keeps my people in chains, literally and figuratively. I don't care what biology or fate or the moon goddess says. I will not accept a bond with someone who perpetuates the oppression of Omegas." Dorian flinched as though she'd struck him, but he didn't back away. "Then tell me what I need to do," he said urgently. "Tell me how to fix this. The laws can be changed. I can issue royal decrees. I can reform the entire legal system if that's what it takes. Just tell me what you need." She laughed, but there was no joy in the sound. "You think it's that simple? You think you can just wave your hand and undo 5 centuries of systemic oppression? Even if you genuinely want to change things, and I'm not convinced you do beyond wanting to claim your mate, it would take years of sustained effort. It would mean fighting your own council, probably fighting half the noble families in the kingdom. It would mean admitting that your family's entire legacy is built on lies and oppression. Are you really prepared to do that? To risk everything for people you've been taught your whole life are inferior?" Dorian's jaw set in a stubborn line that she was beginning to recognize. "Yes," he said simply. "If that's what it takes to be worthy of you, then yes, I'll tear down everything my father built. I'll spend my reign undoing the damage of my ancestors. I'll prove to you that I can be better than they were." Mira searched his face, looking for any sign of deception or manipulation, but all she saw was raw honesty and a desperate kind of determination. It terrified her how much she wanted to believe him, how much the mate bond was already influencing her, making her want to give him a chance, to see the best in him. She steeled herself against it. "Words are easy, Your Majesty," she said coldly. "Actions are what matter. If you truly want to prove yourself, then start by removing these chains. Start by releasing me from this dungeon. Start by making a public declaration about the true history of the Omega laws and your intention to reform them. Do that, and maybe I'll consider believing you're serious." Dorian reached for the chains without hesitation, his hands hovering over the silver. But the moment his skin made contact with the metal, it burned him too, his alpha nature reacting to the pure silver. He hissed in pain, but didn't pull away, working at the locks despite the damage it was doing to his hands. The chains fell away, and Mira gasped as her wolf surged forward, no longer suppressed. The mate bond hit with full force, and she swayed on her feet, overwhelmed by the intensity of it. Dorian caught her, his burned hands gentle on her arms, and the contact sent electricity racing through her entire body. She could feel his emotions through the bond now, a chaotic swirl of desire and determination, and guilt, and hope. It was intoxicating and terrifying. She pulled away from his touch, needing distance to think clearly. "The bond will make this harder," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "It will make me want to forgive you, want to trust you, even when I shouldn't. You need to understand that I'm going to fight it. I won't let biology override my principles. If you want any kind of relationship with me, you're going to have to earn it despite the bond, not because of it." Dorian nodded slowly, cradling his burned hands. "I understand," he said, "and I accept those terms. You'll have your freedom. You'll have your public declaration, and I'll give you something else." He moved to his desk, pulled out a key, and unlocked a drawer. From it, he withdrew a thick stack of papers. "These are draft proposals for legal reforms," he said, spreading them across the desk. "I've been working on them since the historians confirmed your documents. Full legal rights for Omegas, access to education in all professions, equal weight for Omega testimony in courts, protections against forced bonding and assault. It's comprehensive, but I know it's not enough. I need your help to make sure I'm not missing anything, to ensure these reforms actually address the real problems Omegas face." Mira approached the desk cautiously, scanning the documents with growing disbelief. These weren't vague promises or token gestures. These were detailed, well-thought-out legal changes that would fundamentally transform Omega rights in the kingdom. He had clearly spent days working on this. Probably the same days she'd spent in the dungeon, wondering if she'd ever see sunlight again. The realization hit her hard. He had been fighting for this, for her people, even before he knew she was his mate. That has to count for something, doesn't it? Her wolf whispered. Mira silenced the traitorous thought and focused on the documents. This section on education, she said, pointing to one of the papers. It's good, but it's not enough to simply allow Omegas into universities. You need to establish scholarship funds because most Omega families can't afford tuition. You need to mandate that universities actively recruit Omega students and hire Omega professors. Otherwise, it's just permission on paper without practical access. Dorian grabbed a pen and began making notes in the margins, his expression intent. What else? He asked. She found herself drawn into reviewing the proposals, her historian's mind and her passion for justice, overriding her caution. For the next several hours, they worked side by side, Mira identifying weaknesses and gaps, Dorian refining and expanding the reforms. The mate bond hummed contentedly at their proximity and cooperation, but Mira did her best to ignore it. This was too important to let mystical forces cloud her judgment. As dawn light began to filter through the windows, Dorian called for servants to bring food and fresh clothes for Mira. When she emerged from the washing room, clean for the first time in a month and dressed in simple but well-made garments, she found Dorian staring at her with an expression of wonder that made her heart skip, despite her best efforts to remain unmoved. "You're beautiful," he said softly, then seemed to catch himself. "I mean, you were always, but that's not. I apologize. That was inappropriate." Mira couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. "For a man who commands armies and rules a kingdom, you're remarkably awkward at personal interactions," she observed. Dorian had the grace to look embarrassed. "My father raised me to be a king, not a person," he admitted. Emotional connections were seen as weaknesses. The only thing that mattered was strength, control, dominance. I realize now how much damage that philosophy has done, not just to me but to everyone I govern. He hesitated, then added quietly, "I want to be different. I want to be better. I just don't always know how." The vulnerability in his admission touched something deep in Mira's chest. She was beginning to see that the Iron King was as much a victim of his upbringing as anyone else, trapped in a role that demanded he be something other than human. "That doesn't excuse the harm you've done," she said carefully, "but it does make me believe you might be capable of change. The question is whether you'll follow through when it gets difficult. When your council fights you, when the noble families threaten rebellion, when changing the system costs you personally." Dorian met her eyes steadily. "I will," he promised. "I know you don't believe me yet, and I understand why, but I'm going to prove it to you, Mira. I'm going to prove that I can be the king this kingdom needs, the mate you deserve." She wanted to tell him not to make promises he couldn't keep, but something in his expression stopped her. Instead, she simply nodded and returned to reviewing the reform documents. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Dorian made a public declaration about the historical documents, acknowledging the fabrication that had justified the Omega laws. The kingdom erupted in chaos, just as he'd predicted. Riots broke out in several cities as Omegas celebrated and demanded immediate change, while conservative alphas protested and called for the king's abdication. The royal council was bitterly divided. Lord Castellan, the chief interrogator who had wanted Mira executed, led a faction demanding that Dorian recant his statement and suppress the historical evidence. But others, including some surprising allies, supported the king's reform agenda. Through it all, Dorian stood firm. He weathered the political storm with a determination Mira had to admire, even as she maintained her emotional distance. He invited her to council meetings, asked for her input on every decision, and publicly credited her with bringing the truth to light. He established a commission of Omega scholars to advise on the reforms, with Mira as the chair. He used his royal authority to fast-track changes that would normally take years to implement. And slowly, painfully, things began to shift. The first Omega graduated from the Royal University. The courts accepted their first case with Omega testimony given equal weight to Alpha testimony. New laws protecting Omegas from forced bonding and assault passed despite fierce opposition. Mira threw herself into the work, grateful to have purpose beyond navigating her complicated feelings about Dorian. But the mate bond made it impossible to truly avoid him. She felt his presence like a constant pull, knew when he was stressed or exhausted or discouraged even from across the palace. And despite her determination to keep her distance, she found herself seeking him out, offering support and encouragement when the political battles grew intense. If you're enjoying this journey and want to see more stories that challenge the status quo and explore themes of justice and redemption, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. One evening, about 2 months after her release from the dungeon, Mira found Dorian alone in the royal study, staring at a letter with an expression of deep weariness. She knocked softly on the doorframe, and he looked up, his face softening when he saw her. "What's wrong?" she asked, stepping into the room. He held up the letter. "The Northern Territories are threatening secession if I continue with the reforms," he said flatly. "3 of my most powerful dukes have signed this, along with 24 lesser lords. They're calling me a traitor to my bloodline and saying they'll only recognize a true Alpha King who maintains proper hierarchy." Mira's stomach dropped. Civil war. They were threatening civil war. She moved to his side, reading over his shoulder. The language was inflammatory and dangerous, filled with barely veiled threats. "What will you do?" she asked quietly. Dorian set the letter down and turned to face her. "What I have to do," he said. "I'll meet with them, try to negotiate, try to make them understand that these changes strengthen the kingdom, rather than weaken it. But if they insist on rebellion, then I'll put it down. I won't let fear of conflict stop me from doing what's right." She could feel his resolve through the bond, solid as stone, but she could also feel the pain underneath. He didn't want war. He didn't want to send wolves to kill other wolves over this. But he would if he had to. Mira made a decision in that moment, one that surprised her. She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. His sharp intake of breath told her he felt the same jolt of electricity she did. "You're not alone in this," she said. "Whatever happens, you have allies. You have me." Dorian stared at their joined hands as though she'd just handed him something infinitely precious. "Does this mean—" he started, hope bleeding into his voice. She cut him off gently. "It means I see you trying," she said. "It means I believe you're sincere about change. It doesn't mean I'm ready to accept the mate bond fully, or that I've forgiven everything. But it means I'm willing to stand with you in this fight because it's my fight too. These reforms matter to me and my people more than any personal feelings." His disappointment was palpable, but he nodded in understanding. "I'll take whatever you're willing to give," he said softly. "Even if it's just friendship and alliance, that's more than I deserve." They stood there for a moment, hands clasped, neither quite willing to break the contact. Finally, Mira squeezed his hand once and stepped back. "Tell me your plan for dealing with the Northern Lords," she said, shifting into practical mode. "Maybe we can find a way to avoid bloodshed." They spent the rest of the night strategizing, and by dawn they had developed a proposal that might, just might, convince the rebels to back down. Dorian would offer the Northern Territories greater autonomy and representation in exchange for their acceptance of the Omega reforms. It was a compromise, but one that might save lives. The negotiations were tense and difficult, but ultimately successful. The Northern Lords agreed to stand down, though their acceptance was grudging and came with constant reminders that they were watching the king closely. But even as that crisis resolved, others emerged. Conservative factions within the capital began organizing, spreading propaganda about the chaos and moral decay the reforms were supposedly causing. There were several attempts on Mira's life, each one narrowly thwarted by loyal guards. And through it all, the mate bond grew stronger, making it harder for Mira to maintain her emotional walls. She began to notice small things about Dorian. The way he always made sure she had her favorite tea at council meetings. how he positioned himself between her and potential threats without making it obvious. The exhaustion he tried to hide as he worked late into every night, determined to personally oversee every aspect of the reforms. The gentleness in his voice when he spoke to Omega petitioners who came to the palace seeking his help. She saw him embrace criticism and admit mistakes rather than defend his ego. She watched him choose the harder right over the easier wrong again and again, even when it cost him politically. And slowly, inexorably, she began to fall for him. Not because of the mate bond, though that certainly didn't help her resistance, but because of who he was proving himself to be. The turning point came 6 months after her release, during the Festival of the Winter Moon. Traditionally, it was a celebration where the king would reaffirm the kingdom's laws and hierarchy. This year, Dorian had decided to use it as an opportunity to formally ratify the Omega rights reforms. The entire capital turned out for the ceremony, filling the grand plaza in front of the palace. Mira stood on the royal balcony beside Dorian, acutely aware of the thousands of eyes upon them. When Dorian stepped forward to address the crowd, his voice rang out clear and strong, amplified by the acoustics of the plaza. "My fellow wolves," he began. "For too long, this kingdom has been built on a foundation of lies. For too long, we have allowed injustice to masquerade as tradition. For too long, we have treated our Omega brothers and sisters as less than they are, less than we are, less than the wolves the moon goddess created them to be. Today, that ends. Today, we acknowledge the truth that historian Mira had the courage to bring to light, even at the cost of her own freedom. Today, we ratify reforms that will ensure every wolf in this kingdom, regardless of their rank, has equal rights under the law. And today, I publicly apologize to every Omega who has suffered under the unjust laws of my ancestors. I cannot undo the past, but I can commit to building a better future." The crowd's reaction was mixed, cheers and jeers competing for dominance. But Dorian pressed on, undeterred. He read through each reform, explaining in clear language what it meant and why it mattered. And then he did something that sent a ripple of shock through the assembled wolves. He removed his crown and knelt before Mira. "This Omega," he said, his voice carrying despite the calm. Gasps from the crowd, saved our kingdom from continuing down a path of injustice. She risked everything to speak truth to power. She has worked tirelessly to ensure these reforms actually help those who need them most. She is a hero of this kingdom, and she deserves to be recognized as such. With that, he produced a medal, the kingdom's highest civilian honor, and held it up. The crowd fell silent, watching in disbelief as their king honored an Omega in a way typically reserved for war heroes and great scholars of alpha rank. Mira's hands trembled as Dorian placed the medal around her neck. Their eyes met, and she could see in his face that this wasn't just political theater. This was his truth. She was his truth. When he stood and turned back to the crowd, he made one more declaration that sent the plaza into absolute chaos. "And there is one more truth I wish to share," he said, his hand finding Mira's and holding it high. "Mira is my fated mate. The moon goddess herself has bound us together. Some may see this as a complication or a scandal. I see it as proof that the old hierarchies were always a lie. If the goddess can bind an Omega to an Alpha King, then how can we claim Omegas are inferior? How can we justify treating them as less than? The bond between mates is sacred, and I am honored beyond measure that the goddess saw fit to give me someone as brave, as intelligent, and as compassionate as Mira." The crowd erupted, some in celebration, others in outrage. But Mira barely heard them. Her entire focus was on Dorian, on the man who had just publicly claimed her as his mate in front of the entire kingdom, knowing it would cost him politically, who had knelt before her, an Omega, in a gesture of respect and honor that shattered centuries of protocol, who was looking at her now with such open adoration and vulnerability that her breath caught. Later that night, after the ceremonies had concluded and the crowds had dispersed, Mira found Dorian on the same balcony, staring out at the city lights. She approached quietly, but she knew he sensed her presence through the bond. That was quite a declaration, she said softly. He turned to face her, and there was uncertainty in his expression. Did I overstep? He asked. I wanted you to know, wanted everyone to know, how I feel. But I should have asked you first if you were comfortable with me announcing the bond publicly. I'm sorry if I put you in an uncomfortable position. Mira shook her head, a smile, tugging at her lips despite herself. You knelt before me, she said. An Alpha King knelt before an Omega in front of thousands of witnesses. Do you understand how significant that was? How many barriers you just shattered? Dorian's expression was earnest. You deserved the recognition, he said simply. You deserve to be honored for what you've done. Rank should never have determined worth in the first place. She stepped closer to him, her heart pounding. For 6 months, I've been fighting the bond, she admitted. Fighting my feelings for you because I was afraid. Afraid that if I gave in, I'd be betraying my principles. Afraid that you'd revert to who you were once you had what you wanted. Afraid that this was all too good to be true. But watching you today, watching you risk your crown to honor an Omega, to honor me, I realized something. You're not the man who threw me in that dungeon anymore. Maybe you never really were. Maybe you were just a man trapped in a role you didn't choose, doing what you'd been taught was right, until someone showed you a better way. Dorian's eyes were bright, with unshed tears. Are you saying? He whispered, hardly daring to hope. Mira closed the distance between them and cupped his face in her hands. I'm saying I'm done fighting this, she said. I'm done fighting you. I'm done fighting us. I accept the bond, Dorian. I accept you. Not because of fate or biology, but because you've proven yourself worthy. Because you've shown me that you can change, that you can grow, that you can be the partner and the king I need you to be. The kiss was inevitable, a collision of lips and souls that had been building for months. The mate bond snapped fully into place, and Mira gasped at the intensity of it, feeling Dorian's emotions flood through her love and relief and joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dorian rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said simply. I know I'm supposed to be eloquent and poetic, but those are the only words that matter. I love you, Mira. I will spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of you. She smiled, her own eyes wet. I love you too, she admitted. Moon, help me. I love you too. They stood wrapped in each other's arms as the moon rose over the capital. Two wolves who had been enemies finding home in each other. But their story was far from over. The reforms had been ratified, but implementing them would take years. There would be more. Political battles, more resistance, more danger. And sure enough, the very next morning brought news that turned their brief peace into alarm. Lord Castellan and several other council members had fled the capital in the night. Worse, they had stolen classified military documents and were believed to be heading for the eastern border, where they had allies among the border guards. Dorian immediately called an emergency council meeting. It's a coup attempt, one of the loyalist advisors said. Grimly, Castellan has been planning this for months, waiting for the right moment. He's going to try to seize the eastern territories and declare himself protector of traditional order. If he succeeds in taking the border fortresses, he could hold them indefinitely. We'd be looking at a protracted civil war. Mira's mind raced. The eastern territories were heavily militarized and conservative. If Castellan managed to rally them, he'd have significant forces at his disposal. Dorian, we have to move fast, she said, before he can consolidate power. What are our options? Dorian was already studying maps, his expression grim. We have 3 loyal legions within a day's march of the eastern border, he said. If we send them immediately, we can cut off Castellan's route and prevent him from reaching the fortresses. But it's risky. If I strip the capital's defenses to deal with this threat, we leave ourselves vulnerable to other attacks. Mira studied the maps, her historian's knowledge of the kingdom's geography clicking into place. What if we don't need the full legions? She suggested. What if we send a small, fast-moving force to get ahead of Castellan, while the main army mobilizes more slowly? If we can capture him before he reaches his allies, we eliminate the threat without leaving the capital undefended. Dorian looked at her with admiration. That could work, he said. I'll lead the strike force myself. Absolutely not, Mira said immediately. If something happens to you, this whole kingdom falls apart. Send your best commander. But you need to stay here and hold the capital. The mate bond pulsed with Dorian's reluctance, but he recognized the wisdom of her argument. The next few days were tense as they awaited news from the strike force. Mira stayed close to Dorian, offering support as he dealt with the political fallout of the attempted coup. Several other conservative council members resigned in protest, but surprisingly, others stepped forward to fill their places, including some alphas who had been quietly sympathetic to the reforms all along. And then Elena, the healer who had first helped Mira in the dungeon, came forward with shocking information. Lord Castellan didn't act alone, Elena said, her hands twisting nervously. There's a larger conspiracy. Some of the noble families have been planning to overthrow you since before the reforms were even announced. They saw you as weak because you were willing to question tradition. Castellan was just their opening move. Mira felt ice settle in her stomach. How deep does this go? She asked. Elena pulled out a stack of letters she'd stolen from the quarters of a noble she worked for. Deep, she said grimly. At least a dozen major families are involved. They're planning to declare your kingship illegitimate and install your cousin Marcus as a puppet ruler who will restore the old laws. Dorian's face had gone pale. Marcus, he said quietly. I trained with him as a boy. I trusted him. The betrayal clearly cut deep, but he pushed past it to focus on the practical concerns. Do we know when they plan to move? Elena shook her head. Soon, she said. They're waiting to see if Castellan succeeds. If he takes the eastern fortresses, that's their signal to act. If he fails, they might delay or change tactics. We need to root them out now, Mira said firmly, before they can coordinate. Dorian, you need to arrest the conspirators before they can act. He hesitated, and she could feel his conflict. Through the bond. The thought of arresting and trying his own nobles, his own cousin, clearly pained him, but she also felt his resolve forming. You're right, he said finally. We can't be merciful when it comes to treason. Not when the stability of the entire kingdom is at stake. The arrests happened that night, swift and coordinated. Dorian's loyal guards moved through the noble quarter, taking the conspirators into custody based on Elena's evidence. It was a calculated risk. If they were wrong, if the evidence was fabricated or misinterpreted, Dorian would be seen as a tyrant arresting innocent nobles. But if they were right, they would prevent a catastrophic civil war. The evidence proved ironclad. Searches of the arrested nobles' estates turned up weapons caches, treasonous correspondence, and detailed plans for the coup. Marcus, when confronted, confessed everything, perhaps hoping for leniency. He and the other conspirators were tried before a special tribunal. Their treason, laid bare for all to see. Dorian showed them more mercy than they deserved, commuting death sentences to permanent exile for those who cooperated with the investigation. But there was no question that justice had been served. Meanwhile, news came from the eastern border. The strike force had caught up with Castellan's group and captured them without bloodshed. Castellan himself chose death over capture, throwing himself from a cliff rather than face trial. The border fortresses remained loyal to Dorian. The coup had failed. In the aftermath, Mira found herself reflecting on how much had changed in less than a year. She had gone from a nobody archivist to the king's mate and one of the most influential voices in the kingdom. The reforms she had fought for were becoming reality, transforming the lives of Omegas across the realm. And she had found love in the most unexpected place, with a man who had grown from her jailer to her partner. Dorian found her in the archives one evening, her natural habitat, surrounded by books and documents. She looked up as he entered, a smile automatically crossing her face. It still amazed her how just seeing him could lift her spirits. Escaping your kingly duties? She teased. He grinned, that rare expression that transformed his usually serious face into something boyish and beautiful. For an hour or two, he admitted. I wanted to see you. He crossed to where she sat and pulled her to her feet, his arms wrapping around her waist. Also, I have something to ask you. Mira's heart skipped. The serious tone in his voice suggested this was important. What is it? Dorian took a deep breath, and she could feel nervousness radiating through the bond. Marry me, he said simply. Not because you're my fated mate, though you are. Not because it would be politically advantageous, though it would be. Marry me because I love you, because I can't imagine facing the future without you by my side, because you make me want to be better than I ever thought I could be. Marry me and be my queen, my partner in truth, not just in name. Tears sprang to Mira's eyes. She had known this was coming eventually, had felt through the bond how much he wanted to formalize their union, but hearing him ask, seeing the vulnerability and hope in his expression, still took her breath away. Yes, she whispered. Yes, of course I'll marry you. The kiss was tender and sweet, full of promise for the future. When they broke apart, Dorian produced a ring, simple, beautiful, but set with a stone that matched her green eyes. He slipped it onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her, which, knowing him, it probably had been. The wedding was held 3 months later, a celebration that united the entire kingdom. For the first time in history, an Omega would be crowned queen, not as a consort, but as a full co-ruler with equal authority. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Mira stood before the assembled nobles and common wolves, alike, dressed in a gown of silver and white, and spoke vows that promised not just to love and honor her mate, but to serve the kingdom and fight for justice for all its people. Dorian's vows in return were equally powerful, promising to rule not through fear and domination, but through wisdom and compassion, to always value her counsel, and to continue the work of reform they had started together. When the crown was placed on her head, Mira felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. But she also felt Dorian's steady presence beside her through the bond, his unwavering support and love. They would face the future together, as partners and equals. The changes they had implemented were only the beginning. There would be setbacks and challenges ahead. Some regions would resist reform more stubbornly than others. Old prejudices wouldn't disappear overnight, but they had proven that change was possible, that courage and conviction could overcome even centuries of injustice. Years passed, and the kingdom transformed. Omegas attended universities in equal numbers to alphas and betas. The courts treated all testimony equally regardless of rank. Omega scholars and leaders rose to positions of prominence based on merit, rather than being held back by discriminatory laws. The historical truth about the fabricated Omega uprising became common knowledge, taught in schools as a cautionary tale about the dangers of propaganda and unchecked power. And at the center of it all were Dorian and Mira, the unlikely mates who had somehow found love in the midst of political upheaval and had used that love as a foundation to build something better. They faced resistance together, celebrated victories together, and raised their children in a kingdom that valued justice over tradition. Before we conclude this story, I want to thank you for watching. If this tale of courage, justice, and unexpected love resonated with you, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue creating these stories that explore important themes through supernatural romance. Mira never forgot her time in that dungeon, the fear and anger and desperation of those days. She kept those memories close, a reminder of why the work mattered, why they could never become complacent. Every Omega who graduated university, every Omega who testified in court and was believed, every Omega who chose their own path without fear, was a testament to what one person's courage could accomplish. And Dorian never forgot the man he had been, the casual cruelty born of ignorance and indoctrination. He used that memory to fuel his commitment to justice, to remind himself that growth required constant effort and self-examination. Together they became a legend, the Omega who defied a king, and the king who chose justice over power. Their story was told and retold, inspiring generations to come. But for Mira and Dorian themselves, the greatest reward was a Simply each other, the love they had built, despite impossible odds, and the knowledge that they had made their world a little bit better. 20 years after that fateful day in the archives when Mira had discovered the hidden documents, she stood once again in the Grand Library. But this time, she wasn't a lowly archivist. She was Queen Mira, dedicating a new wing of the library devoted to Omega scholarship and historical preservation. The crowd gathered for the dedication included wolves of all ranks, a sight that would have been unthinkable 2 decades earlier. Dorian stood beside her, his hair now touched with silver at the temples, his hand warm in hers. As she cut the ribbon and declared the new wing open, she thought about the girl she had been, brave enough to speak truth, but never imagining she would one day stand here as queen. History remembers the bold, Mira told the assembled crowd. But it's not the bold who change the world alone. It's those who choose to listen to uncomfortable truths, who have the courage to admit when they're wrong, who commit to doing better. My husband was raised to be an autocrat, but he chose to become a reformer. Our kingdom was built on lies, but we chose to face the truth. Each of you has the power to make similar choices, to stand for justice even when it's difficult, to demand better from your leaders and from yourselves. The crowd erupted in applause, but Mira's attention was on Dorian, on the pride and love shining in his eyes. Through the bond, she felt his emotions as clearly as her own, a mixture of gratitude and awe and deep, abiding affection. Later, as they walked through the palace gardens in the fading light, Dorian pulled her close. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. "The path we chose? The difficulties it brought?" Mira thought about the question seriously. They had faced assassination attempts, political betrayals, constant resistance from conservative factions. The work was never done, the battle never truly won. But she had also seen real change, had witnessed the transformation of countless lives, had built something meaningful with the man she loved. "No," she said finally, "I don't regret it. This was always the path I was meant to walk. I just didn't know I'd have you walking beside me." Dorian smiled and pressed a kiss to her temple. "I'm the lucky one," he murmured. "You saved me from becoming a monster. You showed me how to be worthy of the crown. You gave me a purpose beyond just holding power." They continued their walk in comfortable silence, the mate bond a warm presence connecting them. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the city, alive and thriving. Somewhere out there, an Omega child was studying to become a doctor. An Omega lawyer was preparing for a case. An Omega teacher was inspiring the next generation, all because one woman had been brave enough to speak truth to power, and one man had been strong enough to listen. As the moon rose over the palace, Mira thought about legacy, about the stories that would be told of them long after they were gone. She hoped that wolves would remember not just the romance, though that was part of it, but the real work of transformation, the difficult conversations, the political battles, the sustained effort required to create meaningful change. She hoped they would remember that justice required sacrifice, that growth required humility, and that love, real love, demanded we become our best selves. Dorian seemed to sense the direction of her thoughts. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she admitted. "Where we started, where we are now, what comes next." He chuckled softly. "Always planning ahead," he teased gently. "Can't you just enjoy the moment?" She smiled and leaned into him. "I am enjoying the moment," she assured him. "I'm just also aware that moments like this, peaceful and perfect, are precious because of how hard we fought for them. And because the fight isn't over. It never really is. There will always be more work to do, more injustices to address, more people who need our help. That's the price of caring about justice. You never get to rest on your accomplishments." Dorian was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "But we don't have to carry the weight alone anymore. We've built institutions, trained the next generation of leaders, created systems that will outlast us. That has to count for something." "It does," Mira agreed. "It counts for everything." They returned to the palace as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new resistance to overcome. But tonight, they had each other. They had the kingdom they had built together, and they had the knowledge that they had made a difference. In her study later that evening, Mira sat down to write in her personal journal, a habit she had maintained throughout the years. She wanted to record her thoughts about the library, dedication, about the progress they had made and the work still ahead. But as she put pen to paper, she found herself writing something different, something more personal. "Today I was reminded," she wrote, "that the greatest changes often begin with the smallest acts of courage, a single person, choosing to speak up, to challenge injustice, to demand better. I was that person once, terrified and alone in a dungeon, uncertain if I would survive, but determined that the truth would. And now I stand as queen, not because I sought power, but because I sought justice. To anyone who might read this in the future, know that you too have that power. The power to speak truth, to challenge unjust systems, to inspire change. It won't be easy. You may face opposition, danger, even imprisonment. But if you stay true to your principles, if you're willing to fight for what's right, even when it costs you everything, you can change the world. I did. And if an Omega archivist can defy a king and transform a kingdom, then truly anything is possible." She set down her pen and looked at the ring on her finger, the symbol of the love that had grown from the ashes of conflict. The future was uncertain, as it always was, but she faced it without fear. She had Dorian. She had her purpose. And she had proven to herself that she was strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. In the royal bedchamber, Dorian was waiting for her, reading through reports as he often did before sleep. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening. "Finished your writing?" he asked. She nodded and climbed into bed beside him, curling into his warmth. "Just recording the day," she said, "making sure our story is preserved accurately for future historians." He chuckled and set aside his reports, wrapping his arms around her. "And what will those future historians say about us?" he wondered. She considered the question. "They'll say we were imperfect people who tried to do the right thing," she decided. "They'll say we made mistakes but learned from them. They'll say we loved each other enough to change, and we loved our kingdom enough to fight for it. And maybe, if we're very lucky, they'll say we made things a little bit better than we found them." Dorian kissed the top of her head, emotion thick in his voice. "I think they'll say much more than that," he murmured. "I think they'll call you the savior of wolves, the Omega who freed her people from centuries of oppression. I think they'll tell stories about your courage and brilliance for generations." Mira smiled against his chest. "And what will they say about you?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "I hope they'll say I was wise enough to listen," he said finally. "Strong enough to admit I was wrong, and lucky enough to be loved by someone extraordinary." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, the mate bond pulsing gently between them. Two souls who had found each other against all odds, and had used their connection to heal not just themselves, but an entire kingdom. And in the years that followed, Mira's prediction proved accurate. History did indeed remember her as the savior of wolves, the Omega who had defied an Alpha King and won not through violence or domination, but through truth and perseverance. But she was remembered for something more important too. She was remembered as the woman who had shown that love and justice were not opposing forces, but complementary ones, that the truest strength came from lifting others up rather than holding them down, and that even the most broken systems could be healed by those brave enough to try.